Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Unblocking Success podcast. As always, hosted by myself, John Pearce, on behalf of London Drainage Facilities. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Richard Wilson. We are live and kicking, Richard.
Great.
Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me
John.
today.
Thank you for having me.
Every time your name is mentioned, I think I have to start here. It is said with such high regard. We were just talking a moment ago. Nigel Lucker, a good friend and a supporter of the show, who's been on himself as well, speaks so highly of you as well, as does everybody else whenever your name pops in.
So, thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you. Look, your backstory. You need a mop and bucket to clear up the blue chip names that you've been working for and done work with, right? So usually the best place to start is at the beginning. So maybe we'll start there and you run us through your career and we'll take it off.
Sure, by all means. Yeah. I'm an engineer by background.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to go to university and studied engineering for 3 years. I think it's a strength and a weakness of our business that it's such an eclectic mix of backgrounds and an eclectic mix of people. Sometimes it's difficult to articulate our profession because there's chefs and there's engineers and there's cleaners and there's project managers and there's surveyors. It's a really complex mix of different people from all sorts of different backgrounds, and sometimes that makes it difficult to sort of like define our profession. And I know people struggle to understand it. It's the typical sort of dinner party thing. What do you do on facilities? So you do the loo rolls and change the light bulbs, right? You can see people instantly glazing over and turning off. But as I'm saying, sort of I wandered off the subject. My background's an engineer. I'm a professional engineer by background, and I actually spent the first 10 years of my career straight after university. I was sponsored through university by ICI. When ICI were a big conglomerate, a multinational conglomerate, employed 55, 60,000 people. So I spent the first 10 years of my career working as an engineer, project engineering, construction, commissioning, maintenance engineering. And that was, I worked in America a couple of times, worked in Europe a bit, worked in the Far East in the middle of the jungle in Taiwan, which was an event all in itself. And through that route, eventually went into hard FM, I guess is the natural route from that, and from there into much broader sort of FM, the TFM, and then property management and real estate management. So that's the early stage of that career.
Yeah, and FM. Did you start that when you were abroad doing your travels, or did you make that decision when you come back?
I was headhunted. I've been quite lucky. I mean, everybody has to have some luck in their career, right? Yeah. Nobody gets where they get to purely on skill or ability, and I probably have had more than my fair share of luck over the years. I was headhunted to go and work as the operations manager for an FM company that were focused on delivering FM to Marks and Spencer.
Oh, okay.
Which is a very interesting, kind of a change of pace for me. Having worked in heavy industry with like really heavy kit, some of the stuff you end up maintaining and looking after is a little bit like toys. You get very sort of patronising about it. The BSE kind of end of the kit is much the other end of the scale from some of the stuff we were maintaining and installing and project managing at ICI. But it was focused on Marks and Spencer. There was 3 companies nationally, and that was reduced shortly after I joined to 2 companies. And so that's really where I sort of cut my teeth in FM. It was providing mechanical, electrical, plumbing, maintenance to the stores. We had ISTs, in-store technicians across all of the stores, and also did the cleaning, which I guess is in hindsight is a slightly odd combination.
It is, yeah. One extreme to the other.
One extreme to the other, and the cleaning was completely outsourced.
Right. Okay.
Whereas the ME maintenance was a hybrid. We had our own technicians in a lot of the stores, but employed an awful lot of subcontractors as well. Yeah. But you know what? A good place to learn, and learnt an awful lot about retail as well.
Yeah.
The very hierarchical organisation of Marks and Spencer's was then. It was around the time they made their first £1 billion profit. So it was like it was £1 billion turnover. It was a good time for them. Yeah. It was really, I guess, at their commercial peak. Yeah. Very interesting organisation. You can learn an awful lot from that. Yeah. I think we all learn all the time. Hopefully, you never stop learning.
Of course. Yeah.
Life itself is a learning process. Yeah. But also, it was interesting to see the retail business, the retail industry close to.
Yeah.
Those guys are really good at what they do.
Absolutely.
And they will be able to understand, if you put the grapes there and the pants there, you sell more socks. And it's almost as...
the psychology part that comes into it, the marketing part is next level, right?
It's incredible.
Yeah.
But they're right, and they do know it.
Yeah.
They know exactly how you merchandise retail goods.
Yeah.
And again, quite an interesting mix of foodstuffs and clothes.
Yeah.
But it works for them, and they were really, really good at it. And a very fast-paced, very moving sort of industry.
Do you feel, I mean, obviously, again, such a blue chip brand and name there, right? When you're landing into a business like that and you're dealing with those challenges, was that an overwhelming sensory overload to begin with, or was it just something that you were comfortable getting straight off the bat and going into?
I wouldn't say it was overwhelming. It wasn't overloading, but certainly to begin with was a very fast, very fast learning. Because at ICI it was totally owned as such. The main business wasn't the engineering. The main business was making chemicals. Slightly artificial workplace and slightly artificial industry. Which is why I ended up leaving in the end, because you never meet a customer if you're an engineer. You almost never see a product.
No,
because it's all contained in pipes and pumps and tankers. And you're quite far detached from your ultimate marketplace. Clearly, Marks and Spencer's and retail was very, very different from that. You're right in the marketplace, and you literally trip over customers day to day. They may not be your direct customers. They're actually the store's direct customers, but you have a big interface with them immediately.
What would you say some of the early lessons were when you were dealing with that hybrid model of having your own in-store technicians as well as subcontracted service partners as well? What kind of early lessons would you adopt from that? Was there any challenges or pinch points along the way?
The interesting thing is with the in-store technicians, they very much felt they belonged to the stores and belonged to Marks and Spencer. They weren't Marks and Spencer employees, but they felt like it. They looked like it, and they were absorbed into the culture. And there's always a balancing act to be struck. And actually, the subcontractors very much the same. They had been working with Marks and Spencer in terms of projects and install for many, many years, a lot of them. And again, they probably knew the individuals, knew the structure, knew the stores better than you possibly could. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Like, get absorbed right into your client's culture.
Of course.
But if you're trying to create some change, if you're trying to implement stuff that's a little tricky or a little challenging, clearly you have to do it in a very distinct way, and you have to learn the politics of that. I've always felt, treat people and act with people how you expect to be treated yourselves. I think in not just Marks and Spencer, but in many, many workplaces, it's with FM, it's easy to be thought of as the caretaker, as I say, the guy that changes the light bulbs and changes the loo rolls. And we are much more than that. We're much better than that. We're much bigger than that. We have much more to contribute to industry than just that.
I totally
And
agree.
I think if you act like someone, particularly in some of the hierarchical organisations, if you act like someone that's just there to carry the bags, you will be treated like someone that's there to carry the bags. If you act like someone that's got a right to a place at the big table, then you'll be treated like that. I'm not saying you go in pompous or arrogant, but you certainly should go in as an equal and someone that's got something to contribute to those businesses.
Totally.
And you then have to, as I say, you've got a workforce that oftentimes are to be transferred into you, and who associate and who see their culture and their workplace as the client base much more than yours. It gives you a whole different management challenge, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. Where was the next journey? Where did it take you thereafter?
Well, the company itself was actually, I worked for a company called Dudley Bear at that time, who started as a fit-out company. Again, focused predominantly on Marks and Spencer's, although they grew from that, and that was sold to Molam. And I then transferred into Acumen FM, for those that can remember that, which was Molam's sort of specialist FM arm, and worked with some very, very good people there. And my first role was to manage the first generation outsource of AXA's TFM program, actually. So again, I went from M&E plus a bit of cleaning to actually a full TFM contract, again, learning curve very steep at the beginning of it. And it was actually 4 different businesses. It was their health business, it was a couple of big insurance businesses, and it was AXA Corporate. So again, quite a sharp learning curve for me, because it was mobilising a brand new contract, managing all of the 2P, both second hand into our supply base and into the organisation itself. So setting up, mobilising, managing all of the contracts, all of the people, all of the structure. So quite a sharp learning curve. Again. Very, very interesting.
Yeah. How big was the size of the team that you were working with to be able to mobilise something like that?
Well, the immediate team was relatively small when we started up, but it was I guess 50 or 60 people transferred into the organisation, and clearly as we renegotiated, retendered a lot of the contracts, the main 2P bulk was between suppliers.
And when you do have that, you have that inflood of new people coming into a business, the change management piece that comes into it. What kind of advice would you give to people that do go through that process, that all of a sudden have people 2P'd over, and it's a culture shock for them? Sometimes for the people that are here, they might find that a little bit, okay, well, who plays what role now and everything else. How do you kind of navigate your way through there, and what advice would you give on that?
I think, 2P transfers and what have you are no different from any other management challenge. Just be straight with people, be honest with people, be visible to people if you're leading any particular team. And basically don't spend your whole life in an office. Get out there and it's almost a cliche, but it doesn't mean it's not true. Get out there and walk the floor and meet people, talk to them, and listen to their concerns, because they're very, very real. Sometimes it's easy to get lost in kind of the big picture. And see what we're trying to achieve strategically with any given contract. But most of the people who are going through that change themselves, it's as much change for them as it is for you, if not more so. It is the way they make their living. It is the way they pay their mortgage, their bills. They feed their kids, and it's very real to them. And you have to make sure you understand and deal with and are considerate to their concerns. That's what I would say. Get out there and talk to people.
For sure.
Don't worry too much about the legalities up the front. Don't worry too much about the money. You can get there in due course. And I think, despite all the technology, despite all the clever stuff we do in FM and estate management, and there is a lot of it, there's no two ways about it, we are still fundamentally a people business. And I think anybody should try and understand that. If I could give one bit of advice, it sounds slightly patronising, but if I could give one bit of advice to everybody and anybody, understand we are fundamentally a people business. And very often the people in our teams are remote from the central office or the headquarters. They are embedded in the client's properties. And it is easy for them to become and to feel isolated. The key thing is making sure people aren't, making sure you're contactable, making sure you're in touch, making sure you do talk to people.
And I think from my own experiences, that's where everything really does start to fall down. And resonating on your point there, when you're dealing or looking after remote teams and remote people, if you do leave that, it will completely just run its own course, and it will feel completely detached from the hub, the organisation itself, and that's where everything starts to fall down, right?
It is.
Where did you move over to thereafter? Where was the next step in your career?
After Molums, I went to Johnson Controls. You sent a list of the FM names, but funny enough, it wasn't on the FM side. I went to the services side of Johnson Controls, and was a regional director. I ran. They had slightly different names, Johnson Controls, for their roles, but basically ran the business in London, the South East. But on the services side, so on the M&E side. And a lot of that business was based around Johnson's sort of BMS systems. A number of companies at the time operated, designed, built, installed BMS systems, and they were closed protocol systems, which was an interesting sort of commercial slant, and meant you could monopolise a lot of the maintenance and the installation going forward. But I think Trend kind of broke that when they introduced an open protocol BMS system and through their Trend houses, which kind of blew that whole business wide open. And I'm going to say in hindsight, rightly too. And was that a big shock in the company that you're working in at that point of that coming in as well? The Trend, yes, it was. It was seen as a big threat, and I'm going to say it was right for the business to do that.
Yeah.
Because some of the margins that were made on some of the work, it was unsustainable.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It was unsustainable. And interestingly, the kit was very, very clever kit,
Right.
capable of an awful lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But one of the things I've learned over the years is as an industry, we often underuse BMS systems in the equivalent.
Yeah.
I mean, we're getting even more into technology recently, currently.
Yeah.
And the whole AI challenge is going to be an interesting one.
Absolutely. Everyone I speak to from FM, block management included in this as well, whenever I say what kind of pivotal changes do you see coming on the horizon, everyone says the same thing. The way that AI is adapting, this is going to be a game changer into the business.
Yes.
And I don't think anyone's really dialed into the commercial aspect of how AI is going to impact a lot of the FM businesses yet. A lot of people are kind of dialing in and trying to figure it out. But where it is still so new, everyone's going through that same cycle of trying to understand, well, where is the benefit? Where's going to be the downfall? And do you see that being a threat or a benefit to people within the industry, the introduction of AI?
I think it's, I'm going to slightly prevaricate, I think it's both.
Yeah.
I think AI is both not just to our industry, but to many, many industries.
Yeah.
I mean, as an industry, the property industry, property management industry, we've looked at things like the Internet of Things and intelligent buildings. And my perception is, and it may be that I'm out of touch with where that actually stands, is we've never quite nailed that.
Yeah.
And there was always the holy grail of getting a single coherent set of data, which in my perception we've never quite managed. We have lots of really clever kit, all of which provide their data separately. We can knit together reports on that, which appear to be a single coherent report, but I think is actually rather clever cloning software and takes data and reporting from a lot of different sources and then knits them together into a single report.
Yeah.
We've never quite managed to integrate it into a single system that gives us an entire picture for property management and PM. AI clearly has provides the opportunity to do that. And to increase the sort of the world of intelligent buildings and how we actually manage and operate buildings. But there are always challenges in that when you totally automate control and operation of buildings. I think we've all seen too many sort of movies where AI takes over the world and starts World War III.
Liverpool Street, Terminator 4.
Exactly, precisely there. So as I say, I'm going to slightly dodge the question. So I think it's both. Clearly, the potential to do something clever and intelligent with it. I've always thought that good data informs good decisions. All right. But you've got to make sure it is good data. And that you are using it to steer what you do in the right direction.
Yeah, that's always a trick. 90% of the time, data in some capacity is broken, right? So it's always trying to go through that cycle and that process of trying to clear it up. What are some of the early challenges that you faced within your career that you might share on?
Some of the I'll tell you some of the interesting challenges I've been through. I went to Kia as the MD of their FM business and was on the board of their services business.
That mop and bucket's ready to clear that name drop up as well. So I'm ready there.
You're ready there. Again, interesting because doing the FM for a construction company again was a slight departure. But a lot of it was a real big mix. Whereas I guess most of my experience up at that time had been private sector, so privately owned or listed buildings and properties and portfolios. A lot of the Kia work was public sector, which again is an interesting learning experience. That the whole OJU thing, etc., how you actually tendered stuff was relatively new to me, so you had to learn all of that as you go. And actually, the time I was there was the time, I'm going to say, at the peak of PPP type arrangements. And for a company like Kia, which was a construction company, they were interested in getting the construction of these projects and the SPVs that were set up to own and manage and actually do the commercial side of those projects. And that was where a lot of people made their money in the secondary and tertiary financing of those projects. I don't think I'm being unkind when I say the FM was almost an afterthought. And it was something that went with the whole package. And you can debate the rights and wrongs of PPP, and whether it was the right way to go in hindsight. That's a whole different debate, I guess.
Yeah.
But what I know as a fact is the FM parts of construction companies and FM companies that provided those services into construction companies, into those projects, were left with some very complex, very onerous contracts to actually manage. They were very difficult to manage. And in particular, there are all sorts of performance guarantees written into those contracts, which became very difficult to manage, and clearly were locked in there for a long, long time. The contracts were for 20, 25, 30 years. And there was a whole renewal program also that went with that. So there were brand new specifications of brand new buildings. And as part of that, you were trying to predict how much it was going to cost to maintain for 20 and 25 years. Those programs were locked into the contracts.
Wow.
I mean, how do you predict how often you're going to replace the chillers in a school for 25 years when it's built to a completely new specification?
Yeah.
But that you were contractually obliged to those. So the learning point for me was very much learning as you go and trying to cope with those programs and the budgets that would come into those programs as a result of those 25-year programs.
Were there ever occasions where the budget went out the window and we missed? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And those conversations then that you're then having to have to say the reasons as to why, what kind of advice? Because I know for some people in middle management, senior management that might be going through that run now, right, of having those experiences of dealing with people they're having to report to, what advice would you give when you're facing those difficult conversations?
Well, I mean, again, I always think honesty is a key thing in business. Be very, very straight. You have to learn how to articulate and present stuff as in the best way to present your own case. But we'll always be honest and don't try and be clever with it. But I think quite rightly, some of the health trusts and some of the school governors boards will push back and say, well, that was your problem. You bid it commercially.
Yeah. I
appreciate it's not ideal if you're making a loss now every year for the next 20 years, but that's kind of not our problem.
Yeah.
You've signed up to that, and you now have to deliver it. Very interestingly, one thing that I did learn about clients and about working with clients there is the partnership scores where the head in particular, down to one individual, supported it, wanted to achieve it, were successes. Certainly operational successes, if not necessarily a great financial success. If the head was opposed to the idea and saw it as an undermining of their authority and their school and their people, it was very, very difficult to turn that around. Yeah,
sure.
And one school in particular, very interesting. I went to a meeting supposedly with the head and some of the governors. And myself and a colleague walked into the meeting and we were completely ambushed. As we walked in, the head had clearly been there for half an hour. There was a slideshow of all the problems with all of the school that had newly been built. There was this, that, the other failure. Right. There were local authority people. There were governors. There were PTA representatives. There were student body representatives, all sat on the other side of the table. Completely ambushed as we walked through the door. And that was a very interesting situation.
Yeah, interesting situation, eye-opening, and a big learning point.
A big learning point. Yeah. Any experience you never, you learn from everything.
Yeah. So Kier, thereafter, where did you land? After
Kier, I went to. This was Kier. I guess after Kier was my first departure from pure FM, if you like.
Yeah.
Pure FM delivery, and I then joined a company called MBN Trust.
Right.
Which was set up by Nelson Bakewell Real Estate at the time. And was there to provide FM into their managed portfolio, managed on behalf of propcos and the financial institutions, etc., where they had chosen to invest in properties, commercial multi-lets, retail, mixed use, developments, etc. But the organisation was really there to deliver into the common areas of those buildings, and again was a combination of hard services and soft services.
Yeah. Key learning points that came out of that point in your career?
It's an interesting whole world. You're dealing with it's the key learning point about that is the complexity of the commercial situation.
Yeah.
The contract you're managing as a managing agent.
Yeah.
So again, a lot of learning there.
Yeah.
The contract is actually with the landlord, but you're trying to protect that contractual line. The suppliers are actually subcontracted to the landlord, not to yourself, but you're managing the contract on behalf.
Mm-hmm.
And the actual tenant's contract, their lease, is also with the landlord. So you're getting right in the mix of that, right in the middle of that, without actually being in the contractual line. You're a managing agent, not a managing principal.
Yeah.
So the commercial complexities of that was an interesting time.
Yeah.
And again, we talk about steep learning curves at various points in careers. A steep learning point about the whole service charge thing and quite how that works, how RICS code works. Yeah. The protection there for you. Basically, you've got two sets of clients there. You've got the landlord, and you've got I used to call the landlords the clients and the tenants the customers, just to kind of differentiate in their head. Different sets of clients, both of whom have a vested interest in what you do and how you do it and the success with which you do that. They have slightly different imperatives. They're paying slightly different bills for slightly different things. And the landlord just wanted occupation and the tenancy to be as high as possible for very obvious reasons, and were mainly interested in the capital worth of the building because that's what their business was all about. And therefore were interested very much in getting the rent in and getting the occupancy of the buildings as high as they could, but also interested in the underlying rate of the rent as well, because that's what dictated the capital worth of their property. The tenants very much were interested in the standard of the service and the delivery of the service, and just wanted a pleasant place for their employees and their staff to actually come and work and live and occupy. So slightly different imperatives. Different stakeholders, different imperatives, different interests, different drivers, and you just have to learn to balance those all.
That's it. It's the management act, isn't it, between the different stakeholders and how you manage their expectations and their wants out of you, and the service that you're obviously providing to each, right? So
I was really lucky at NBN Trust to have an amazing team. I've been very lucky across my career. I've worked with some really genuinely great people. They didn't always realise how good they were. Until we started developing the confidence in people and the scope for them to actually stand on their own feet. But some really great people over many, many years.
Thereafter, where did you hopscotch onto next?
Well, that business was ultimately sold to Capita. Again, interesting to observe how Capita deal with stuff.
Right.
They were very, very good at what they do. Clearly they're an acquisitive business and they manage it in a very set, very structured, very professional way. Over the years, I've seen good acquisitions and bad acquisitions.
Where do good acquisitions form? What are some of the common traits that happen with a good acquisition? And then we'll flip that. Be interesting to get your take on really what's the opposite. Where does it all fall apart?
Good acquisitions are again, they involve the people. They consult with the people. They understand the nature and the culture of what it is that they're buying. And they acquire and mobilise or integrate to a process, to a set structure, to a set tool.
Do you think speed plays any pivotal role in a successful acquisition? I.e., when you do acquire, you operate really quickly to set the tone and set...
I would say so, because everybody's going through a big change. Very, very quickly. And again, as we said earlier, it's important that you lock in the people. It's particularly important you lock in the clients. Because if you don't, and again, there's a direct comparison there with poor acquisition. I've experienced poor acquisition where people were actually just driven by the deal. And were acquiring on cheap debt in a rising market, which is relatively straightforward to do. But when the market turns, which inevitably it does, it's a very, everything is very cyclical. Financial markets are very cyclical. It then becomes more difficult very quickly. And if you haven't locked in the people, if you haven't locked in, as I said, it's a people business.
Of course.
People buy from people very much in our business. If you haven't locked in the key people, if you haven't locked in the key client, the business will walk straight out the door. And all the business you very carefully accumulated on cheap debt you're left with nothing, and that's happened to a number of people.
Yeah.
So the key thing is do it to a structure, do it to a process, involve the people, engage the people, get them locked in emotionally and I guess financially. And the same with the clients.
Yeah.
Talk to the clients, talk to the people.
Yeah.
You ignore them at your peril, I think.
Yeah, that's it. I think, resonating completely with what you're saying, where I've seen acquisitions fall apart is, we touched on this earlier, the acquisition goes ahead, it completes, people are then left in limbo. There might be one or two talks that might take place with a wide group of people. But then, of course, you've still got lots of murmurs, lots of people unsure about job security, the certainty of futures and things like that. And if you don't then start to get into the weeds into it and start plucking out the detail and spending time with people within a business, it all falls apart, right?
Yeah,
So,
and isn't that the same for 2P? When you're doing a simple retender and a 2P transfer?
Absolutely, yeah. Next part of your career, where did you then go?
MBN Trust, happy to do what they do really, really well. I have a huge admiration for the way those guys went about their business.
Yeah.
But what they tend to do is chunk business into bite-size lumps of business, which is how they manage what they do.
Sure.
They then inevitably get rid of the MD and the FD, and that duly happened.
Yeah.
And I went to GVA to do a similar sort of thing at GVA Grimley, as was.
Yeah.
And again, that was a very lucky enough to have a great team there. But was able to apply all the learning I got from MBN Trust.
Yeah.
In that place as running that business. I went initially as the ops director, but fairly quickly moved into the MD role there.
Yeah.
And it was a similar sort of thing. Did some very, very interesting projects there.
Yeah. Yeah.
For example, Prestbury acquired St Catherine Docks, and so working around that sort of place, again, a very mixed-use organisation, lots of complex stakeholders, quite a complex commercial, bits of development, bits of letting, some service that needed sorting out, some interesting and challenging residential tenants in that place, first time in my life I'd ever employed lock keepers, which is an interesting project. Yeah. And again, doesn't that explain what estate management's all about? We've already said it's a very complex and very
evolving,
eclectic mix of people. Yeah. And you learn those things as you go.
Yeah, yeah.
I think what is interesting to me is people very often, quite rightly, have ambition. They always want to be a director. They want to be seen as a director or a senior manager or whatever else. I think my advice to people would be careful what you wish for, because there's quite a lot of responsibility comes with that, and you need to understand that it's not just a title. There's other stuff comes with that. And I think in hindsight, I'm probably a better director than I was a manager or a senior manager. I'm probably.
Where would you say the differences are?
It's a big picture thing. I'm not always the best detail manager. I'm better at pulling teams together and setting direction and setting the vision, and then helping people, the people that are much better at it, achieving that objective. I've always thought that, funnily enough, you were talking to Nigel a few weeks ago, and Nigel and I used to sit and have long chats over a glass of something occasionally about business and about how you do it. Sometimes with some of his guys, who was one of the guys that worked with him when he was at the Foreign Office, you used to join us on some of those occasions and just talk about business, and we agreed. I said to both of them on a number of occasions, you don't have to be the cleverest or the best person in the room to lead that room. In fact, my advice would be always employ people that are better than you, always engage people that are better than you, and your job as a senior manager is to get those people who are better than you into a room, into your team, and just try and remove all the rubbish that distracts them, and try and just give them the time and space to do their job, which they are really able to do. And our role as a senior manager is to give direction and to just give clarity, remove all confusion. If you can do that and just let people run and do their jobs, which they do very well, you're halfway there.
Yeah, that's solid sound advice. Yeah.
But I also think, it's very interesting, as I say, people actually want that director title, and I get it. I understand why it's a very prestigious thing, but as I say, be careful what you wish for, because there's a lot of different stuff comes with it, and legal responsibility, whether you're a statutory director or not, that comes with it. Particularly around health and safety, particularly around the financial viability of what you're running. But I think it's once you have achieved the director's role, people assume you can do director's roles.
Yeah, of course.
And probably you don't really do them effectively till your second or third go at it.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies to a managing director role. The most difficult director's role, the most difficult managing director's role to get is the first one. And once you've got it, there's this almost weird assumption that you can do another one.
Yeah.
And as I say, you probably don't learn to do it really, really effectively till your second or third go at both of those roles.
What were some of the learning points when you did manage to achieve your first MD role?
When you start managing roles at scale, and some of the biggest organisations that I've managed to have like 4,000 or 5,000 people in them, you clearly cannot know the detail,
of course,
of everything that's going on in every building and every person. You can get out and visit as many as you possibly can. You can get out and meet as many people as you possibly can, and talk to them and hear about their views and their concerns, as we discussed earlier. But you learn this sort of technique, and you have to learn it for yourself. I think it's important. It's important that as people go through their careers and develop themselves as a manager, they have to develop their own identity as a manager.
Yeah.
Develop their own style, their own modus operandi. And you can observe good people and learn from that, people that you admire, people that you recognise are achieving. And you can also observe and learn from people that aren't very good, or at least are not very good in your own estimation. Things that people have got wrong, things that people have made other people feel bad or not managed to empower and engender their teams. You can learn from both. But through those processes and through those experiences, you do learn your own identity and your own style as a manager.
Do you think mentorship, I want to kind of link it into what you're saying here, mentorship, do you think that plays a key role when going through the process? I had this conversation recently with somebody, right? I was talking about my own backstory and places and roles I've gone, and people kind of said to me, did you want to do that role? And the reality is, when I took the GM role at a company, I didn't necessarily want to do the role. I was really successful at the commercial side. I was really successful at the client relations side. And the role came about for general manager of this company, 250 engineers, 150 staff. And it was the owner of the company that turned around and said, I want you to do the role. And I remember at the time thinking, I don't actually think I want to do the role.
Yeah.
And then you kind of take it, you bite off a little bit more than you chew. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
And then kind of figured it out from there, and then rolled off. And people kind of said to me along the way, well, as you've kind of gone into different parts of your career, and I totally resonate with what you're saying, sometimes you can look at these fancy titles and go, I'll take that, but be really careful what you're wishing for.
Yeah.
But the mentorship, I've been blessed and fortunate that I've had, and I'm always adding to this pool of people with vastly greater experiences than me, but it allows me to pluck out some of their wisdom and some teachings and soundboard.
Yeah.
Have you had that in your own career, and do you think it's important to try and find that out in the working world as you are ascending?
Yes. There's several comments I want to make on that.
Yeah, sure.
A director's role, but particularly a managing director's role, is quite a lonely role.
Yep.
You've got to want it. Don't drift into it. You've got to want it, because ultimately it stops with you. And and the thing that the sort of lesson, the example for me was that I was in my first MD's role. I was at an event where we used to present certificates and badges to people who had achieved a certain amount, service representatives. And I was in the role. We had lunch with everybody afterwards, and it wasn't run terribly well. It wasn't very well organised, and people were just drifting about. And I was thinking to myself, God, this isn't very good. Someone needs to do something about this and get it aligned. And I thought, well, Christ, it's you. So you better get on with it. And from that point, understand a lot of the buck stops with you. So it is quite a lonely role.
Yeah.
You've got to want it. You can talk to many people inside and outside your organisation, but the buck does stop with you, and you have to understand that. I'm a great believer in the manager, the senior manager, as a coach. You actually are there to coach and develop people to get better, to allow them to get better, because undoubtedly people will. And it never fails to amaze me and delight me with the fact that people will fill that gap and will rise to the occasion on most of the time. But the mentorship is a slightly different thing to me. You know, the coaches and managers an internal thing and a line management, but inevitably there are connotations with that. Whereas mentorship is very much an external thing. And I've had some really good mentors over the years. Not always, not continually, but always good mentors. People that I trust, people whose judgment I trust, and someone you can just go and discuss stuff with and bounce ideas off. So I would always say seek a good mentor outside your own organisation, and I think it's essential that it is outside your organisation. You need some third-party views on some of what you do some of the time.
Yeah.
And it's also very important, and I think do it in combination with your line manager or your director, whoever that is. Make sure they've bought into that whole thing, because that sort of relationship is very, very key. But your choice of mentor is key. Make sure there's a good personality fit. Make sure you're culturally very similar, behaviour very, very similar, and be very careful. And again, ask others' advice about engaging with mentors, and it will pay dividends. Always have a mentor at various stages in your career.
Yeah, solid sound advice. Yeah, for sure. Next step in your career, where did you end up thereafter?
I joined what was DTZ at that point.
Okay.
Again, slight departure. I joined initially to run their hub. So working with the IT, working with the project management, working with the insurance businesses, and looking at the client finance side of the business, so processes and systems, which was a bit of a departure to me. I was used to running big teams and running people and running budgets. So I worked there for a while. A really interesting opportunity with then DTZ and Cushman Wakefield.
Yes.
I mean, it was actually technically an acquisition of Cushman Wakefield by DTZ, but I think that's probably to do with where the debt sat on the balance sheet.
Right.
And it felt more like a merger than an acquisition of any sort.
Yeah.
And again, a whole learning opportunity and some very interesting experiences there. The Cushman business was very strong in Europe. The DTZ business was very strong in the UK. And the combined business actually kept the Cushman and Wakefield brand, I think because it was so strong in America. And it became almost overnight became one of the big players alongside the CBREs and the JLLs. Not quite on the scale of CBRE, but similar sort of scale to JLL at the time.
Yeah.
And it changed the whole feel of the organisation. But actually, the integration of the PM was headlined as asset services within that business, but the integration of those two businesses quite disparate, and suddenly doing a role that was across a number of countries, 14 or 15 countries across EMEA, again was quite a challenge. And getting around and talking to those guys and making sure we moved towards an integrated common system across the whole piece was a challenge and an interesting project learning experience. Again, some people, interesting to see different countries, different cultures. Some people really, really wanted to integrate and just wanted to work in a similar way. Some people were really, really opposed to it.
Yeah.
And clearly the added complexity of a language that I was certainly a long way from fluent in, or didn't speak a word of in some cases, was very, very interesting. You know, at the extreme, sort of Scandinavia, Europe, Bahrain, very, very interesting challenges culturally.
Yeah, I've had minor exposure to that. I worked in Singapore and I worked in Zurich for a little while. And yeah, culturally, they're so different.
Yeah.
You know, Scandinavia and Asia, that their way of working. And again, no, we're linking back to Nigel here, but Nigel worked out in Singapore the same time I was in Singapore.
Right.
So it was just completely different mindset, I think. Have you found cultural differences and managing teams in cultural differences? What were some of the learning points you've picked up from having that experience?
Again, some huge differences. And going back to the very early stages in my career when I worked in the Far East, working in a place and the value sets, the cultural value sets of the individuals there You have to appreciate them.
Yeah.
You have to understand them. You have to. You can't always accept all of them.
Yeah.
But you have to find a. You take a Machiavellian approach. You have to get to that point. And a prime example of what I'm talking about. And I worked in part of ICI that manufactured cyanide and worked with cyanide.
Right.
Clearly, you can't mess about with that stuff.
Yeah.
But example, in the country I worked in, a lot of the individuals were Buddhist.
Right.
And they had a Buddhist value set.
Right.
And a very different, almost fatalistic approach. And I'm not saying this is generic across the whole piece, but it was what I experienced there. Almost a fatalistic approach to health and safety, to try and then manage those individuals to take a much more proactive approach to health and safety was an interesting challenge. And you're not just changing the way people work. You're really challenging some of their fundamental value sets and some of their culture. Yeah. And you have to tread very, very carefully when you're doing that.
Yeah.
So I learnt that at a very sort of early sort of stage. I was 27 or 28 at the time. Wow. In the middle of the jungle with no real direct help from anybody else other than the team you've got around you, which was a dozen people.
Yeah.
You learn how to cope delicately and be very sensitive to people and appreciate what they are, but at the same time driving towards the endpoints that you actually want. That was a really salutary lesson, and I was able to use that and interpret that in a lot of the other approaches in some of the countries closer to home when I worked in those.
Yeah. 27. I've never been someone that's really hung up on the age part. I think the line was, age is no guarantor, or youth is no guarantor for innovation, age is no guarantor for experience, right? But 27 years of age, did you ever feel, or have you ever felt a sense of imposter syndrome fly through on any of the roles that you've ever taken off?
Yeah. Almost everyone at some stage or other.
Right, okay.
I think don't we all feel that from time to time?
Absolutely.
Particularly if you've, as I say, I've been relatively lucky with my career and had, had various stages of various different levels of responsibility, shall we say. But again, I learned very, very early, ICI style, with its sponsored students.
Yeah.
Was quite brutal, actually.
Right.
But they used to throw you right in the deep end.
Yeah.
And you either sank or you swam. I'm not sure that would work these days. I'm not sure that would be accepted these days, but that was a long time ago. Yeah. And so at the age of 21, 22, fresh out of university with a nice shiny degree, but absolutely no knowledge of how the real world worked, and no real knowledge of people and how to deal with people. Yeah. I was suddenly managing a team of 20, 25 fitters, highly unionised environment, with very, very strong demarcations. And within my team, I had 2 conveners and a senior shop steward. Very, very interesting time. Yeah. And again, I learnt a lot from those guys. Yep. ICI gave you a supervisor who basically was there to teach you. Similar sort of approach, I guess, to the army. Yep. You nominally have a particular rank on your shoulder, but actually, it's the warrant officers that actually run what's going on. Yeah. And for the first sort of 2 or 3 years or so, they teach the putative officers how to actually be a soldier. It was very, very similar to that. Yeah. We were given very able, very carefully selected supervisors to teach you how to do your job. Yeah, yeah. So learned very, very, very quickly at a very, very early age. Yeah. How to deal with all that. With all of that sort of thing.
There's a lot going on. There's steep learning curves to pick up real quickly.
Yeah.
I'm going to serve this one over to you. And on that pun of serving this over to you, let's talk about Wimbledon.
Let's talk about Wimbledon. Yeah. I've just, as we discussed, I've just come out of 6 years at Wimbledon.
Yeah. What an iconic venue.
Yeah, an amazing venue. In some respects, a lot of people question me when I went to Wimbledon because it appears to be, or was nominally a drop down in, should we say, without being pompous about it, a drop down in level of responsibility and size of role.
Sure.
The role I'd been doing previously was quite a broad role, and it was almost a role that you almost didn't understand what it was actually involved. it was difficult to actually walk away at the end of the week or the month and understood what you tangibly achieved, and was very much almost an ambassadorial role where you spent most of your time in offices shaking hands, being nice to people, talking to people, but walked away, as I say, at the end of the week and the month, not entirely sure of what you'd actually tangibly achieved in that time. And I felt I wanted to drop down a level and get perhaps more to the coalface again. And that's what I did at Wimbledon. Clearly an attraction to go and work at Wimbledon, because totally outside my experience. And it's a wonderful place with wonderful people, Wimbledon, and doesn't always understand whether it's a huge global, iconic sporting event every year with a very big financial turnover and global stars, not just the sporting stars, but global stars visiting every year for those sort of 2 or 3 weeks, or whether it's still a private tennis club. And it's actually both. And it actually flip-flops between the two with very little notice, and you have to be very flexible and agile to deal with it, because it does have that kind of split personality. Fascinating place, lovely people. Again, I was blessed with a great team there, very interesting, lovely people to work with. There is a big role year-round, and people don't always understand that and looking after the role. The classic comment is, well, what do you do the other 50 weeks of the year? When you're not doing that. And there is a lot to do. A lot of the development, a lot of the PPMs, all of the stuff that we would all know and love needs to be in place. Has to be done during those 50 weeks that are left. But honestly, clearly, an awful lot of the effort, an awful lot of the focus is about the championship. And those 2 or 3 weeks, it is. Hopefully they will forgive me for this, but it's controlled carnage. It is really, really hard work, and you have to respond. I mean, through our help desk, we would have 7,000 plus jobs within 2 weeks. For my team to actually deal with, and for our subcontractors to actually deal with. So there is a lot going on. You work ridiculous hours, non-stop, for day after day after day, in the hope that by the end of the fortnight, you've crowned 2 people as singles champions, and the wheelchair competition, which is great and growing and vibrant, and all of the doubles as well. That's obviously one. If you've achieved that, that's what it's all about. But there is an awful lot goes on behind the scenes.
What were some of the challenging moments for you with that?
The roofs have become, the famous roofs have become critical to the operation and the delivery of tennis. And also to the broadcasting of that, because clearly the broadcasting of that tennis is very, very important. And they are highly complex pieces of kit. They cost a fortune to maintain and to operate. And sometimes they have given us problems during the championships itself, during matches, even during the finals, which have been solved very quickly by some very, very clever people, some very, very expert people. But it's been pretty close sometimes. And interestingly, you learn how critical to the whole operation and to the whole broadcast and the whole competition itself the HV system is. The supply of power. An awful lot depends on that. I mean, clearly the lighting, clearly the air conditioning, but critically, again, the operation of the roof and the operation of the broadcast. There's a whole broadcast studio at Wimbledon that is critical to the success and the visibility of that championship, and that fails at your peril.
So a hugely, highly pressurized 2 weeks. You're really on the spotlight there. How do you bottle or contain the pressure that is there within that? And do you have any process or management techniques or things that you found along the way that this is how I like to deal with it, or how I think about certain things? Or is it just so inherent into you now through your experience that it just water off a duck's back,
The team that I worked with, banter was a very, very key thing to what we did. And actually sharing the pain, sharing the stress, but having a laugh when it was appropriate to do it. Now, I get banter is a two-edged sword, and you have to be really, really careful that it doesn't lapse into areas that it shouldn't do. There's a certain amount of, in the control room. Once it's set in the control room, it has to stay in the control room.
Yeah.
But you have to, as I say, you have to be very, very careful that it doesn't wander into areas that it shouldn't, and it doesn't become inappropriate. But banter and laughing at others and yourselves was a very, very key part of shedding that stress.
Yeah.
Also, being very careful of the culture you create within the team, and very careful of the people that you select. One of the things I did early doors when I went to Wimbledon was in-source, actually, some of the technical support work, some of the engineering support work around the HVAC and the plumbing, because and the outsource in-source debate is a very interesting one to me. And there is no one size fits all to that, in my opinion. But in this case, all of the staff at Wimbledon are very locked into the culture and the delivery of Wimbledon, what it means to them. They really love it, and they really mean it. And having an in-source team with that particular area of the technical management gave me the flexibility, the response, and the buy-in. Everybody does. We talk about the 3 T's: the timing, the training, and the tools. Providing people have those 3 T's in place, they can do whatever they can do and will do to contribute to the success of that. We engendered a culture where people wouldn't tolerate defects, that good enough wasn't good enough. We had some of these sort of phrases that we all used to use, and people would literally contribute whatever it was they could contribute, and wouldn't walk past anything. If there's a piece of paper on the floor or a discarded coffee cup, people would pick it up and deal with it, and that was part of it. There was none of this, it's nothing to do with me, it's not part of my job. Particularly during the year round, but particularly during the championships, people would contribute and walk past nothing. They would contribute what they could, because it matters. And that's why Wimbledon looks like it looks like when you go around it. And you're constantly say to people, it is immaculate. People respond and say that, and it looks great on the telly. That doesn't happen by accident. That is really, really hard work. So I'm saying, part of the ease of coping with the stress, everybody slightly rolls their eyes, but they secretly love it as well as hate it. And just making sure that service culture is right and appropriate and aligned, and people will deliver whatever they can deliver, and are really committed to that.
And here you are now.
And here I am now.
Here you are now. So new chapters, new beginnings,
Indeed,
and new ventures.
Yeah.
So
I think every job, every role has a shelf life. And I think the key to it is knowing when it's time for you to move on and do something different. And I think the time was right for me and for the organisation to move on and do something different, and to let someone else now have a go at working with Wimbledon and delivering the championships in their own way. So I'm now looking to work, or starting to work in consultancy and interim, which has allowed me, given me the time and the space to actually contribute in a different way, to contribute what I have learned over 30 years in our industry, and to help people and work with people and do some really interesting stuff as a consultant, as an interim manager. So to do a number of shorter term projects and a number at once. So that's my challenge and my interest.
That's your challenge and your interest right now. I mean, listen, again, like I said, what a collection of companies, experiences, the depth and breadth of your knowledge in what you're doing. It's palpable. You can feel, what you've done. Advice to others coming through, so a new generation entering into the world of facility management, what advice would you impart onto those?
I'm going to slightly repeat what I said before. It's the people. The thing that I will always carry, the thing that I'll always take away, the thing that will always make me smile is the people that I've worked with over a number of years. But the other thing that I would say is throw yourself into it, but don't stay in a job you don't enjoy. Nobody enjoys all of their job all of the time. You can't. It's impossible. Or if you do and if you can, you're very, very lucky. But you've got to enjoy 80%, 90% of it. And if you don't, go and find something else that you do enjoy. Don't just stick with it because it feels so. I mean, I feel slightly in free fall myself a little bit in a moment. It's quite a step. To go from gainful employment to scrabbling around trying to find work. But don't stick with something you don't enjoy and you don't feel you're contributing to. Go and find something else that suits you better, suits your abilities better. And
the last question really from me, if you were going to rewind the clock and have a sit-down conversation, perhaps with the 16-year-old version of of Richard, what would that conversation look like? What would you suggest to that person?
Do you know, I wouldn't change very much because, again, this sounds like a cliche. Again, it doesn't mean that it's not true. Life is a journey.
Yeah.
And the bad bits and the difficult bits and the sad bits and the unhappy bits teach you just as much and form the person you've become just as much as the good bits and the happy bits. So, I'm not shy. I would try not to tell them too much because you explore and you learn as you go. And that's part of it. That's part of your life journey. I hope that doesn't sound like a cliche. That's part of your life journey. So don't try and change too much because, it can run the danger of changing the individual you become.
Absolutely. Solid sound advice. Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and to do this and to talk to me. The lessons and the experience that you've got there are paramount. And I would applaud anyone that might be listening, watching at home, to stay tuned for more episodes like this and more importantly, to follow Richard's journey. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
John, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.